The proposal of a 20% tax on non-alcoholic beverages is sending ripples through the drinks industry in Nigeria. The new proposed policy was announced following a 10 naira per litre tax policy imposed on non-alcoholic drinks earlier this year. Now, we've seen the conversations about taxation continue to gain traction across the continent as more and more governments are looking for how to expand their tax nets and bring in more tax revenue. But there is also concern about overtaxation. Zainab Ahmed, Nigeria's Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, introduced the new excise levy of 10% per litre on all carbonated, sweetened and non-alcoholic beverages back in January of this year. The Finance Act, which President Muhammadu Buhari signed into law on December 31st, 2021, contains the new policy, commonly known as the sugar tax. Now, around the world, sugar taxes have been introduced to deter consumption of sugary drinks due to links to diabetes and obesity. Another tax is the planned additional 0.5% tax on the gross turnover of petroleum marketing enterprises. Now joining me is Taiwo Oyedele, Fiscal Policy Partner and Africa Tax Leader for PwC Nigeria. Taiwo, welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Let's start with some of the data we have, which shows that a recent report has shown an 8% decline in revenue of carbonated soft drinks subsector between June and August of 2022. And many are saying that this is a result of the excise tax duty that's in place. Now, experts are also predicting an additional decline in revenue to minus 25% by December 2022 if the policy is not reviewed. So let's start with the policy that's been in place for the past few months, and that's the 10 naira per litre tax. What impact do you think that has had before we now add the excise duty on top of it?
Thank you very much. So you're right, the federal government in the last Finance Act introduced an excise duty tax on carbonated sweetened beverages of 10 naira per litre. And many of us thought at the time that the economic conditions were not right for this tax to be imposed, but government went ahead all the same. We're beginning to see the impact on the sector in terms of the decline in volume and sales. And in fact, the latest report a few days ago by the NBS, Bureau of Statistics, shows that the manufacturing sector is declining. So the growth in GDP was about minus 2%. And for the food, beverage, and tobacco subsector of the manufacturing sector itself, it declined even twice as much, about minus 4%. Now, the issue is really that government in the 2022 fiscal policy measure and tariffs amendment that was approved by the government had indicated that this 10 naira per litre would apply on non-alcoholic beverages for 2022, for 2023, and for 2024. And the reason being that beyond the non-alcoholic beverages, we've always had excise duties on tobacco and alcohol. And government, working with the private sector and the industry players, agreed that having a roadmap for increases was the best thing for them to be able to handle in terms of dealing with uncertainties. What many of us are surprised about is that just shortly after government issued this new directive with a roadmap for the next 3 years, a few months later, government is now, thinking and proposing to further increase the increases. And they haven't justified to anyone what circumstances have improved or have changed from where we were last year to justify these increases. And therefore, the point is that if you are not careful and you keep imposing taxes, particularly on such an important sector of the economy that is labor intensive, at a point when you have a lot of people in poverty and you have high unemployment with rising inflation, it just seems to be the direct opposite of what we should be doing at this time.
Okay, so that's really painting a picture for us of where we are now with the tax and the excise duty that's been in place. So now, if I'm going to ask for you to look into that crystal ball. You know I do this a lot. But Taiwo, if we add an additional 20% tax on non-alcoholic beverages, what then do you think will fully happen to the subsector? It's already seeming like most analysts are predicting doom and gloom. Are you also in line with that? Do you think it's going to be really, really bad news adding another 20% tax?
Yeah, I don't think it's even a prediction of doom and gloom. I think it's just saying the reality based on what the data is telling us, right? So you had the 10 naira per liter that was introduced recently, and we're beginning to see the impact. Although I have to say that that's not the only challenge that the industry is facing, right? We've seen issues to do with FX problems, we've seen issues with supply chain disruption, we've seen issues with rising inflation, which is pushing their costs up, and they cannot pass all of that to their customers. But on top of all of that, you have this excise duty being imposed, in addition to the issues they're having to deal with. Now, the point is, you impose 10 naira per liter, we're seeing this negative decline, right? And then you want to double it. So you're going to just double the problems. And that's the way I would like to put it. It's important to put this in perspective and in proper context. On one hand, Nigerian government says, we want to impose sugar tax, we want to control diabetes and obesity, but the data is saying otherwise. According to the World Health Organization, up to 9.1 kilogram of consumption of sugar per annum is okay for an individual, because it's not like zero sugar is good for your body, right? You just don't want to do it in excess. And the data from even government's own agency shows that Nigeria's consumption is only about 8 kilograms per annum. So in other words, Nigeria is actually a very low consumption jurisdiction when it comes to sugar. So why do we still have obesity? Why do we have diabetes? What the data is saying is perhaps we have a carbohydrate problem, right? And government needs to think about, how do you address the carbohydrate problem where people don't have the affordability to take enough protein and vegetables, and they just default to the regular garri and bread. And then there's also the one about lifestyle. Now, if you are not addressing those, you impose this tax. Maybe sugar consumption will go down slightly than it is, but you won't see the impact, because that is not the major cause of the problem in the first place. So using data to make these decisions are really very important, and ensuring that you consider the overall impact on the economy, just beyond, not even about this sector alone. Think about their value chain. It goes all the way from the farmers providing a lot of the input, to the suppliers, to the employees, to the distributors, wholesalers and retailers, and the industries that there are thousands and thousands, if not millions, of households who are depending on these sectors for their livelihood. This is not the time to make their situation worse than it is.
Okay, so you're talking about timing, you're talking about, of course, the direct and indirect employment that's involved. So it brings me to a question about sort of the peculiarities of Nigeria's micro and macroeconomic realities that we need to take into cognizance. We've talked about many times that African governments are seriously looking for more tax money. They want more people paying taxes, and they want more tax revenue coming in. But when you look at the fact that there's a FX situation, as you've said, there's a situation around electricity that also stops the development and the growth of the manufacturing sector. There are a number of other critical areas that need to be looked into. Are these peculiarities too much right now for the government to really be serious? Or rather, are they too much for the government to make this decision? The government should fix those things before looking at further taxation. What comes first? Is it a chicken and an egg situation we find ourselves in here?
I think it's about looking in the right directions and making necessary, even when they are tough decisions, rather than the easy ones. So we all admit and acknowledge that government needs revenue. In fact, government needs a lot of revenue. But where the revenue will come from, it's not going to be from the excise on carbonated drink, because I can tell you, based on our estimation, that will be, in fact, combined with the increases they are proposing for alcohol and tobacco, it will be less than 90 billion naira. In a country where the budget deficit at the federal level is about 11 trillion, at the state level is about 4 trillion, combined, you're looking at 15 trillion naira. Now, this 90 billion, if everything works well, that is, if demand does not even decline, right, which is not likely to happen, that 90 billion is the amount that NAPIMS, just one subsidiary of NNPC, spent last year based on their accounts on public relations, right? NAPIMS spent 90 billion on public relations. So if you just think about the inefficiency in government and leakages, you have all manners of agencies. In fact, we have about 63 government-owned enterprises that have been asked to go and chase revenue. And what that does is you see a lot of leakages, you see the burden on the private sector, you see high cost of collection and huge leakages and inefficiency. Government needs to address that. That's where the money is. Use data to ensure that everybody who needs to pay the current taxes that are already in place are paying. Not to overburden the people who are trying to do their best, because the more you increase their tax burden, the less competitive they become, given there are other people who are doing business and not paying taxes. So if government we agree on what the problem is, we just don't exactly agree on the approach that government is adopting. Because we think that at the end of the day, even if you impose this tax and you get a little bit more in terms of excise revenue, what's going to happen, which is what we have been seeing, is that because their volumes are declining, your value-added tax collection will go down. Because their profit margins are declining, your company's income tax will go down, as well as education tax. So overall, government would actually be worse off by introducing this tax. You mentioned it in your comment earlier on. Look at electricity. Manufacturers Association of Nigeria said this year alone, their cost of just finding diesel to power the operation has gone up by 400%. Now, you can't keep adding more, especially the ones you can control. We cannot afford to keep increasing the burdens of these very important sectors of the economy.
I feel like I know your answer for this next question, but I need to ask it anyway. Taiwo, do you think that Nigerians are currently overtaxed as it is? Whether it's the individual who somehow is paying out, whether the taxes at the end of the day when they're buying goods and services and things, or even small businesses in particular, which should be the backbone of our economy. Are we overtaxing the Nigerian and the Nigerian business as it stands now?
The answer is definitely yes. It's a capital YES, yes. The reason is that, first, if you start from the bottom of the ladder, there are millions and millions of people that we are taxing that we shouldn't be taxing at all. And I'm sure you also know my view on this, which is what I call taxing poverty. No country can ever become rich by taxing poverty. You become rich by creating prosperity and then taxing it subsequently by your people and their enterprises. And then for even those who are above that poverty line in terms of maybe small businesses, maybe household and large businesses, what happens in Nigeria is if you focus on the headline tax rates, such as VAT, you may quickly jump into the conclusion that Nigeria is a low tax regime. That would not be exactly correct. Why? Because in addition to the formal taxes, which is what we tend to focus on, there is informal taxes, sometimes paid to non-state actors, particularly by small businesses at the local level. In addition to that, there's implicit taxes that we all pay. And these are the taxes that, the burden is when you have to take care of what government should be doing for you. So I finish paying my taxes, but I have to fix the road. I have to take care of my electricity. I have to take care of security. I have to sometimes even contribute to funding of the primary school where my kids are attending school, if they attend a public school. When you put all of this together, you will have one conclusion. And that conclusion is Nigerians, whether individuals or businesses, bear extremely high tax burden. We're paying so much, unfortunately, government is collecting so little. So the problem is government is the one to solve it. Help us fix the problem so that we pay less and government collects more by taking away the informal taxes and the implicit taxes that we currently are dealing with.
There was something you mentioned I want to take you up on, and that's sort of what we've seen in terms of agencies of government all now having some form of revenue targets. We've seen so many agencies become revenue generating agencies, moving them away from their true remits. Not every agency should be chasing a revenue target, a funds target at the end of the year. What do we do about that? Because we've seen it happening around a number of agencies, particularly in Nigeria now, and it is a very massive problem.
It is, because what happens is when you have different agencies, whether it's Nigerian Customs Service, whether it's Port Authority, whether it's Postal Service, and the list goes on, right? So based on the budget for 2023, they have 63 agencies. Now, the problem with that is these organizations and agencies are likely to lose focus of their core mandates, and they'll start chasing revenue. They were never trained and skilled to collect revenue, so they do not have the capacity. So what will happen is, one, they'll keep imposing burdens on the private sector because they want to achieve their revenue targets. Because their collection mechanism is not world-class, so they're going to have a lot of inefficiency in that process. We've seen many of them engaging consultants with very high and ridiculous amounts of commissions that they pay them. So what will then happen is the people will bear the burden, the businesses will struggle, ease of doing business will become more complicated, yet government will not have the revenue to show for it. What you should do, in line with international best practice, is have what we call harmonization of revenue collection functions. It should be only one agency. To be honest with you, only the FRS will collect all revenues. If you are dealing with ports, if you are dealing with customs, if you are dealing with anyone who needs to collect revenue, the FRS will collect on their behalf. In fact, the money doesn't even need to hit the account of the FRS. It can go directly to that agency, but let every agency focus on their core mandate of facilitating growth, facilitating economic development, and supporting businesses, not coming in their ways. So I think that this is one of the areas where government can have what I call a quick win, and the impact will be significant, far more than what they are trying to accomplish by imposing additional taxes and increasing the rates of existing ones.
All right, Taiwo, my final question is this, sort of going back to where we started. The fiscal policy measures, as you mentioned, they were announced in March 2022 by the minister. They contain measures for the enforcement of the Excise common external tariff, but also show more excise duties on goods such as non-alcoholic beverages, alcoholic beverages, cigarettes, tobacco products, and telecommunication services. And we've, of course, heard from the agency and the body for that, who say they are not in agreement with increasing taxes in that regard. They were meant to take off April 1st, 2022. As you said, and many others have said, this seems to be a digression away from the 2022 fiscal policy measures and tariff amendments roadmap. What does government need to do? There's already a 10 naira per litre levy, now a possible 20% additional tax that's coming in on non-alcoholic beverages. Should Nigeria's government reverse course on this, hold off till when? What should be done?
Certainly, yes. When you have policies that, this is not just you making a speech, this is you putting it in writing after a lot and series of engagement. When you have policies that you have pronounced, and you then go against them, the impact will be far-reaching, because it's not just about the sector that is directly impacted. The signaling for the rest of the investing community, both locally and internationally, is that whatever this government says, you can't take it to the bank. So that increases our risk premium for investment in Nigeria, and it doesn't help for a country that needs all the FDI and investment that we can get even locally as well. So what government needs to do is to backtrack. There's nothing embarrassing about it. Is to say we listen, we're paying attention, we understand where you're coming from, private sector, we're suspending this, we go ahead with what has already been pronounced. If anything at all, you can start the conversation for what happens when this roadmap that you just approved expires, and that's going to be in 2024. If you want to start that conversation now, all well and good. But to then go against your own approved roadmap is definitely going to be counterproductive, and government should not please go ahead with that in the interest of everyone.
All right, so we'll see what happens. Manufacturing Association of Nigeria has been speaking on this, as well as many in the private sector. But the need for revenue seems to be driving a lot of decisions, not just from Nigeria, but other African countries as well. Taiwo will be following the conversation closely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And taxes, as well as death, are said to be the two surest things in the world. But beyond them being sure, how much tax does everybody pay? How much does the government actually get in the end of the day? And at the end of the day, are we adding too much of a burden? So eventually, everything that should be accruing to government doesn't end up in government coffers. A lot of conversation that Nigeria's government needs to focus on, but a lot happening with that. We're going to go on a quick, very short timeout. When we come back, we're going straight into international business news. And from there, it's the Career Hub segment powered by the African Talent Company coming your way up next.